Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Our guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Tom Kent, who teaches about Russian affairs and disinformation at Columbia University. He was president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty until 2018. Previously, he was the Moscow bureau chief, international editor, and standards editor of the Associated Press. He consults on disinformation, journalism, and ethics for government, non-governmental organizations, media, and corporate clients. His new book, Striking Back, Overt and Covert Options to Combat Russian Disinformation, will be published in late September 2020. Tom Kent, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
I am hoping that you can give our audience a little bit more background on your very interesting career, and I'm especially interested if you could talk about Radio Free Europe. That is a organization that a lot of people, myself included, are familiar with by way of the famous 1980s song by REM, but it's an actual organization with people that do things very important, and I'm hoping that you can talk specifically about that.
Sure. I've really led two lives. One major part of my life has been journalism. I've worked for the Associated Press in the United States and in Brussels and Tehran and Sydney and Moscow, and then as international editor of AP and as standards editor of AP, which means that I was essentially ethics editor in charge of our professional ethics and professional standards. Then the other part of my life has been as a Russia specialist academically, and again with AP in Moscow, and then subsequently keeping very close to Russian and Soviet affairs for AP. And then finally I was asked by the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is the group that runs America's international broadcasting. It's been renamed since, to run Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And so I took over RFERL as president and CEO and ran it for a couple years up until 2018. RFERL is a large organization. It's got about 1,200 staff, 600 full-time, about 600 part-time, out all over East Europe, Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. That's our broadcast area. And its job is to essentially create a local, independent, free media in countries where freedom of the press is either absent or just embryonic. It operates on government money. It receives a grant from Congress through the Broadcasting Board of Governors, now renamed the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and uses that money to operate. We have a budget of about $124 million a year. The vast majority of the staff are not Americans. They're citizens of the countries in which they live and work. In those cases where they can actually work in those countries, our bureaus are banned from some countries, but in most of them we do have bureaus operating, and we operate in about 25 languages. So it's a very vibrant, very active place.
Could you talk a little bit about the beginnings of Radio Free Europe? It was born out of World War II, was it not?
It was born out of World War II, and originally it was a CIA front. There's no secret about that. It was set up ostensibly as a private organization. It still is a private organization administratively. It's a private company headquartered in Delaware, but it was secretly financed by the CIA up until the 70s. And then after that, it became public that it was financed by the government, and it's now financed quite overtly by a grant from Congress.
All right. Well, you have established yourself as a fellow who is well qualified to talk about overt and covert options to combat Russian disinformation. I'm hoping that you can tell our audience a little bit more about some of the techniques that Russia deploys, both historically, today. Can you trace that story a little bit for us?
Sure. Russia's used a large number of propaganda techniques over time. From the very beginning of the Soviet Union, it was clear to the Soviet leaders that Russia could not survive as the world's sole socialist state, that they needed to have socialist, communist revolutions elsewhere in the world in order to survive. So the idea of spreading their ideology and propaganda and skill in that, language skill, reasoning skill to win arguments became a very, very important part of Russian Soviet ideology. They're very good at it. And all through the 20s and 30s, they were active with the so-called Comintern, operating in West Europe, trying to induce communist revolutions there. And after the war, of course, they sort of forcibly introduced communist revolutions in the countries that they controlled and sought in Asia, Africa, Latin America to advance the communist cause as well. To them, it's a question of survival. And they have always had a very expansionist policy, not just in terms of military expansionism, but ideological expansionism. And although they don't talk much about communist revolution these days, that's out of fashion, the idea of Russia spreading its influence by all possible means remains a top priority.
I would like to remind Cognitive Crucible listeners that on Thursday, October 29th at noon Eastern, there will be a 90-minute virtual panel co-hosted by the Information Professionals Association and the AFCEA Alamo chapter. The panel will discuss convergence and information advantage in a hyper-competitive information environment. You can find out more information at information-professionals.org/events. We're going to start wading into ethics behind propaganda, influence operations, marketing. I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit more about, well, in the subtitle of your book, overt and covert actions. But could you start a little bit by talking about the positive or the legal or the accepted side of influence and ways that we experience daily?
Sure. We are always being subjected to influence, to propaganda, to psychological warfare. I suppose that, even when you're being sold cosmetics, it's a propaganda operation. The question is, what is legitimate, what is not legitimate, and particularly with regard to statecraft and competition among countries. I think that anyone who is familiar with the PSYOP world, the influence operation world, will tell you that the best propaganda, so to speak, is to have something to be proud of, to have a positive message, a message that inspires people. So that's really key. Yes, there are certainly covert means to influence and deceive people. Lots of countries have dealt in that domain. Russia certainly has. The United States, its Western allies, over time, everyone's done one kind or another of psychological warfare or disinformation, but you do best when your overall message is a transparent one and a positive one, and you're bringing people good news, which is what they want most of all.
So, in your experience, does overt messaging, and I'm thinking on the statecraft side, so I'm a child of the 1970s, and when I think back to that time period, there's things like blue jeans and the Marlboro Man, and images of America like that, which seem to have and influence in the world. Were those types of themes intentional, do you think, or do you think that they were, just like accidental byproducts of the way we were living our cultural life, and had positive influence across the world?
I think they were largely accidental. I think we were focused on our own lives and our own commercial industries, on our own entertainment industries, but it had a huge splashover effect internationally when we created all those movies, say in the between the wars or post-war, about the United States and life in the U.S. We were focused mainly on the actors and actresses. But people around the world were focused on, wow, look at that car she's in, or look at that hotel they're standing in. So the opulence of life in the United States, as revealed in these movies, had an effect on world populations probably much more than we even imagined.
Right. So some of that was emergent and not really controlled by anyone, but was a byproduct of the way we were going about our lifestyle there. Well, so earlier, several weeks ago, we had Rand Waltzman as a guest, and I wanted to pick up on a thread there about having a story, having a theme, so, and, I'm hoping that you can maybe, take this from maybe a U.S. centric discussion, maybe start there, but does the West in general have a story to tell, or like a myth, something to update, and either intentionally or in an emergent way, spread throughout the world that would be beneficial?
Sure. This is a big question at the moment. Basically, who are we to preach? Is there anything that we should be proud about America, about the West, that could be the foundation of a good information strategy to the rest of the world? Certainly, the United States has plenty of problems internally, and it is much less of an international beacon of democracy than it used to be. Chris McPherson pointed that out on another one of these podcasts. On the other hand, you have to say that the democratic genie, so to speak, is out of the bottle. For the past several years, it's hard to remember anything before COVID, but for the past several years, what we've seen worldwide are a succession of demonstrations from country to country, from continent to continent, with people demonstrating for democracy, against corruption, for basic human rights. And many of them do still hearken to and think of the United States as a free country, and it is still in many, many ways an extremely free country. It's the essential free country. But these people are demonstrating not because they necessarily adore everything that goes on in America. They're demonstrating because they adore what democracy and clean government could mean in their country. So I think the United States could contribute a lot more than it does to this movement, more than it does at the moment. But it's not like, but I think we flatter ourselves to think that democracy in the world depends 100% on what the United States is doing at any given moment. It's also interesting that we are on the right side of a lot of the things that are going on. When people do hold demonstrations in favor of clean government, against autocracy, for human rights, for self-determination. These days, a lot of those demonstrations, when they're successful, as many of them are, rebound to the benefit of the United States and other Western nations. These are our values. Remember that a few years ago in the Cold War, everyone was accusing the United States of being the one who was supposedly propping up all these authoritarian regimes who were oppressing their people. And it was the Soviet Union that was the great beacon of hope and national liberation for people demonstrating around the world. So, tables have turned, and what's gone around has come around. And even though we may not be as effective or as enthusiastic as we were in supporting some of these movements, to some degree, I think we're sort of on the right side of history.
Right. Well, so getting back to covert and overt actions in order to further the agenda of statecraft of the United States and the West, can you walk us through some of the trade-offs, the ethics, the dynamics of just considering what can we do, what should we do, and there's the old story of if you go down the road of evil or of doing bad things, then you risk yourself becoming what it is that you are fighting against in the first place.
Sure. Well, let's talk first about the overt, since that is essential in my view.
Sure.
The governments of many Western nations are involved in supporting a whole variety of enterprises. A lot of them do support international broadcasting. They are very active in supporting and speaking out for democratic causes around the world. Perhaps most important, they do a lot of funding of non-governmental organizations in different countries that stand for democratic principles and against corruption. Some of these groups they're sort of League of Women Voters kind of groups in different countries. These are people, campaigning for the principles of democracy. They're exposing disinformation, including Russian disinformation. They are campaigning to defund conspiracy websites by getting companies to stop advertising on them. They identify Russian troll networks and report them to the social platforms so they can be taken down. All sorts of things like this are being undertaken by non-government organizations in many countries with support from Western governments and also from foundations, things like the National Endowment for Democracy, the Open Societies Foundations, the European Endowment for Democracy, Illuminate. There are dozens and dozens of organizations all over the United States and Europe that are strongly supporting this kind of work. So it's very important, and I think it's very effective in many ways. These groups have their problems. Some of them are small. They need training, particularly in social network operations. They tend to be stronger in cities and with intellectuals than they are out with rural populations. And there's a lot that needs adjusting and fixing. They could be made much stronger. But in the aggregate, they're very effective. And I'm thinking of Europe in particular, especially East Europe, although we see some sign of this kind of activity in Africa and Latin America.
This is all on the what you would call the overt side of influence.
Yes, absolutely. And it also includes journalists and fact checkers who are very active and very effective in exposing corruption and so forth. Then, there's another level. Some of these organizations have, shall we say, people who deal with other things, or there can be completely separate organizations that are out actually fighting trolls on social networks, sometimes with false identities, penetrating conspiracy chat rooms, getting in there and fighting with people inside them. There are groups that are using all sorts of techniques, from open source intelligence to maybe putting a little money in the right place to obtain information about undercover Russian activities and bring them to light. There are people who are harassing Russian soldiers online. There are people who are hacking the documents of Russians and other actors. So there is that side to it as well. So it's a varied approach, shall we say.
Right, right. And so, what are some of the, risks of, engaging in these kinds of influence operations? If, the U.S. or the West is, consciously, wading into these types of this type of conflict, which is, below the level of armed conflict, over time, there is potentially some kind of an effect that could be noticed within society or culture at large.
Well, there's kind of a sliding scale, isn't there? When you say covert, everybody runs to say, are you saying we should do disinformation? Are you saying we should do everything that they do and become just like them? Well, it's a long way from one end of the covert spectrum to that end. I'll give you a couple examples. Let's suppose that a Western diplomat leaks to a foreign newspaper some true information about how a local politician is taking money from the Russian embassy. I mean, that's technically covert because it's a leak. It's done on an anonymous basis, but it's I think a lot of people would consider that's not that unusual. Officials leak stuff to newspapers all the time. Or suppose there's an independent news organization in an authoritarian country, and we want to get some money to that organization to help them, expose disinformation and generally support democratic causes. And the only way to get money to that organization is maybe through some kind of a not too transparent Bitcoin transfer. That's covert, but is it immoral? Probably not.
Right.
And then, you can move further along the scale. What about creating ostensibly a sports website or an entertainment website, and bit by bit, after you've got an audience, starting to sew in there some political content? Where's that on the scale?
Right. I've thought about the same kind of thing in like online games or even apps that kids are using.
Sure, you can buy ads on video game, or you can get into the chat on the side of the video game.
Right. Well, I'm thinking not even the advertisement or the chat, but the actual content of the game itself having baked into the characters or the story arc of the game, some kind of a covert storyline that would favor adversaries of the free world.
Sure, there's some games that exist now that cast the Russians as the bad guys in Syria and cast Maduro as the bad guy in Venezuela. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right.
So you can do active reconnaissance, as they say. You could go out on social networks with a false identity, engage with bad actors to try to find out who they are, identify them, identify their networks, identify the leaders, find out what they're planning to do next. Is that so immoral? And if you got the stomach for that, some people would move further and say, well, maybe we should use bots with fake identities to redistribute, to amplify true information that isn't getting enough visibility on social networks. Or maybe we should make a fake copy of an adversary site that looks just like their site, but isn't really, and is laced, with our own information. That the United States in the 2018 during the 2018 midterm elections did a cyber attack on the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. And so all these things are on the scale before you get to the end point of disinformation and forgeries of our own. I guess the point of the book, the point of my thinking, is not necessarily that here is the line beyond which we should never go, that there's certain things that are like chemical weapons. We just should never make them. We should only be about defense. But it's something that we ought to talk about. And, a lot of people sort of have this, I guess, out of sight, out of mind view of it. We would never do that. We should never do that. So we never even need to talk about it. But there are plenty of people in the West who think that actually this would be kind of a good idea and that the Russians have it coming. So unless we have some discussion of where the limits ought to be, what we're comfortable with, what we're not comfortable with, what's going to happen probably is either that we will do nothing when we probably should do something, or we will do far too much and be shocked and amazed that it happened. So, let's talk to the degree that you can in the public space about what some of the principles and ethics ought to be.
Yeah, no, you did a really good job there of walking us down the spectrum all the way towards ultimately landing into the world of disinformation and intentional manipulation of data towards another end. After it became so apparent that the Russians had, done some significant meddling in our 2016 election cycle, I'm not downplaying the significance of that, but I am so surprised at the national reaction to that meddling. And for me as a former military guy, I was thinking to myself, it's like, well, of course, the Russians and others, other bad actors would try to meddle in our elections. I mean, the national reaction was that of, surprise and indignation that this could ever possibly happen. And I'm like, it would surprise me if the Russians or other bad actors haven't attempted to meddle in elections, all the way back into the 1950s until now.
Yes, one would expect it of them, and certainly there's been a history of Western countries trying to affect election outcomes in other countries. That's true, right. Yeah. But so what? I think we have the right to try to protect our own elections.
Sure.
And and it's unfortunate that the issue of Russian interference in our elections has become so polarized in the United States. You would think it'd be one thing that Americans could agree on is that other countries should not be interfering in our electoral process.
Right. Absolutely. I agree that there should be a common reaction that this is something that we should not tolerate. We should try to stop that kind of meddling, but we should also expect the meddling to continue, or at least attempts to continue. So
I think it's inevitable, given the openness of social networks and the way the world's information infrastructure works. The point is to try to build a consciousness of that and a resilience in society.
Wow, yeah. We've been talking a bit about the ethics of disinformation and some considerations on overt and covert operations. I try to ask all of the Cognitive Crucible guests if there is another book or two that also could help illuminate these dynamics, something that interested members of the audience can go and check out themselves.
Sure. I would recommend to begin with an old book, but one that's a real classic in the area, and that's Black Boomerang by Sefton Delmer. It's hard to get copies of, but you can read it on scywar.org, and it's the story of British black propaganda in World War II. radio stations that purported to be in Germany that weren't really in Germany, disinformation operations by the British, things that people would be shocked now if you suggested the United States ought to do, but the people who did it then are now viewed as heroes in the war against Nazi Germany. On the ethics front, I'd certainly recommend Do Morals Matter by Joseph Nye, the very distinguished American diplomat and author who talks about the moral aspects of policy. What kind of moral test should we apply to American policy? And then probably also The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder by Sean McFate, who teaches at the National Defense University. He asks a lot of questions about our current military structure. Are we really prepared for an information war? Does DoD think about information the way it should? And where is war going?
All right. Well, thank you for that. My guest today has been Tom Kent. His book, Striking Back, Overt and Covert Options to Combat Russian Disinformation, is out in late September 2020. Everybody go check it out. And Tom Kent, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.